everybody. As you know, I am Dr. Ruth Heisey, the Chief of Family Medicine at Women's College Hospital and the Medical Director of the Peter Gilgan Centre for Women's Cancers. One thing that I am not is a historian. So giving a talk about history is a little daunting for me, especially when that talk is the most important history lesson ever. But it actually is. So here I go. History of breast cancer, part 1. We don't know exactly when breast cancer started coming into women's lives, but we do know that we first saw evidence of it in art and in the Baroque period and in the models that were painted. Clicker? Advance slide, please. Can we have the first slide, please? Thank you very much. So when we go to the Baroque period and we look at art, one of the first things we see is Peter Paul Rubens' The Three Graces. It's a beautiful, beautiful painting, one that he cherished, one that he kept in his possession until he died. He was known for his realism. He painted what he saw, and what he most certainly saw in the left breast of the model on your right was breast cancer. So have a look. You can see the left breast is substantially smaller than the right. The nipple is retracted. There's some ulceration in the upper outer quadrant and some lymph glands in the armpit. And another example, the beautiful Rembrandt entitled Bathsheba at her bath. This hangs in the Louvre in Paris. And the story depicted here is of the beautiful Bathsheba seen bathing from King David as he sits on the terrace of his palace. And as the story goes, he falls passionately in love with her, and he sends her a letter beckoning her to him. And at the same time, he sends her husband, the general, to almost certain death in battle. Not very nice those days, was it? And if you look closely at her left breast as well, you see similar findings. You see the enlarged lymph glands in the armpit, and you see skin changes. These changes, we say in the medical community, we call them peau d'orange, because it's the dimpling appearance that you see in an orange peel as a tumor infiltrates into the skin. So now let's leave the Baroque period, and let's flash forward to the Victorian period in Toronto. We don't really know the chances of a woman surviving her breast cancer in the 19th century and whether they were much better than in the 17th century. But one thing that we do know is that in 1883, they got a little bit better. And that's because that's when the first Canadian physician licensed to practice medicine in Canada, Dr. Emily Stowe, founded Women's College Hospital. The first hospital dedicated to care of women and women's cancers. And many other firsts followed. The pap smear that is now used around the world to screen for cervical cancer. And Dr. Henrietta Banting showed us the value of mammography in diagnosing breast cancers. Amazing, but not the most important history lesson ever. Now let's move to the 1990s, again here in Toronto at Women's College Hospital. The now world-famous researcher, Dr. Stephen Narod, one of the most cited researchers ever, he was part of the team that discovered the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genetic mutations. This pivotal research find was certainly changed the whole way we look at breast cancer and is undoubtedly one of the single greatest advances of our time. So now, let's just go to my family practice office a few years ago, this century. A new patient came to see me. We'll call her Joan. Very kind, very busy, mother of 3 young children. She was a 10-year survivor of breast cancer. I asked her about her relatives. There was an aunt in Poland who died young, but she didn't think it was cancer. And there was a cousin who had a story deemed unimportant, or maybe just downplayed the way families sometimes do when the news isn't good. In any case, she came back to see me a few years later, and now she had fatigue and bloating and symptoms that ultimately were consistent with an advanced ovarian cancer. So we started to think, could she be a BRCA mutation carrier? She went back and spoke to her relatives again. So what are BRCA genes anyways? Well, we all have 2 copies of them, and in most of us, they are our friends. They act as tumor suppressor genes, and they stop the growth of cancer cells. But if you have a mutation in one of them, that gene is no longer effective at stopping the growth of cancer. These genes can be passed down through the mother's side or the father's side of the family. And if you have a genetic mutation, you have a dramatically increased risk of not only breast, but also ovarian cancer. And while we have good early detection strategies for breast cancer, we have no effective early detection strategies for ovarian cancer. As well, these women tend to get their cancers when they're younger, sometimes before that woman has even been offered her first screening mammogram. Now, fortunately, they're not that common in most women, but there are certain groups that they are more common in, like Ashkenazic Jewish women. And one of our brilliant researchers, Dr. Kelly Metcalf, has spent her entire research career improving the identification and care of these women. And she has shown us that if you identify them early and you offer risk-reducing strategies early, you can make a difference. You can substantially reduce the risk of cancer. And this is after only 2 years. So what does a family look like that carries a BRCA mutation? Well, it actually looks a lot like Joan's family. Joan, like Angelina Jolie, was a BRCA1 mutation carrier. And if we had have known this earlier, we could have offered her removal of her ovaries after she finished childbearing, and we might have prevented her ovarian cancer. Now, most of us will not be mutation carriers, but many of us, myself included, have a family history that puts us at increased risk. Does that matter? Is that worth knowing? Well, absolutely, because there is a lot we can offer women at increased risk of cancer. We could suggest that you start your mammograms at age 40 instead of age 50. We might suggest that you have mammograms every year instead of every 2 years. And for some women, we would suggest that you have an MRI in addition to mammography for breast screening. Other women will offer preventive medicines, medications, or preventive surgeries. And for most women, we'll have a discussion about lifestyle changes. You can't change your family history, but you can change your lifestyle. So what lifestyle changes matter? Well, really the most powerful ones are reducing alcohol and increasing activity. For women at increased risk, we do suggest no more than 1 drink of alcohol per day on average, and we do suggest being active. And being active does not mean you have to run a marathon. You don't even have to join a gym. Start small, reward yourself often. Park in that parking spot far from your destination, or get off one subway stop earlier on your way to work. And hopefully, you can work up to 30 minutes of brisk walking 5 times a week. And that's all it takes. And not only does it reduce your risk of cancer, but also your risk of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, anxiety, and depression. So truly a win-win. Now, one of our star implementation scientists is actually using technology in family practice offices to support and encourage women to increase their activity. And it's working. And one of our adjunct scientists is actually with a Canadian-wide team. She has shown us that personalized prevention prescriptions are effective at not only increasing screening behavior, but also positive, healthy behaviors. So we have ways that we can improve and change things and make a difference. Now, back to family history. We know family history is not always that well recorded, and we do know that sometimes family physicians counsel women about genetic testing based on their personal beliefs and values rather than fact. So we have spent some time publishing in medical journals and trying to educate physicians on how better to care for these women. But it's not enough. Joan, sadly, passed away from her ovarian cancer before her 3 children could graduate from high school. And if we had have known Joan's story, her history, her family history, we could have saved her life. So knowing the stories of the Rubens 3 Graces, the Rembrandt's Bathsheba in the Bath, is interesting. Knowing the stories of our great researchers, the Stephen Nayrods, the Kelly Metcalfs, Noah Ivers, and others, is inspiring. But in this century, it's your story, your history that matters. So please, ask your family, who had cancer, what kind, what age was it diagnosed? And then ask us these questions. Do I qualify for testing? What kind of screening should I have? But here I am in downtown Toronto in a room with apparently 901 people, which is amazing. And I hope some of you are going to take snippets of this home with you. You might share it with other women, your mother, your sister, your daughter. But how do we reach those hard-to-reach women across Canada? The women that are living in poverty, women that are caring for others, women that may be hours from the closest family physician. Well, fortunately, with the generous support of the Gilgan family and the establishment of the Peter Gilgan Centre for Women's Cancers and our partnership with the Canadian Cancer Society and its 100,000 volunteers across Canada, we now have a way to get our message to the women who need it most. So you can see that actually, the most important history lesson ever is not really one you get, but one you give to us. So when it comes to women's cancers, knowing your family history is one of the most potent weapons we have in this fight. So help us shift the needle and give us the most important history lesson ever, your family history. Thank you.